Hi there.
Hello.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Doing well. Nice to see you again.
Yeah. Glad we're not pending any more hurricanes or
Goodness. Yeah. I forgot if I asked, did you guys get anything from that? Like any of the offshoots or anything?
Yeah, we got a little bit of a storm. And one of my students actually did deploy some sensors just to kind of see what the wave energy. And so we had
Yeah.
some waves and stuff, but more like a strong storm, not a hurricane.
Yep.
Or even
Yeah. It was so wild. Because I may have mentioned I'm in Savannah, and so I watched it, come over, and then it kind of did its little I mean, we were literally on the edge of everything the whole time. It got a little windy here, but then it just we just skirted it really closely. It was pretty wild. So
yeah, we see
yep.
that. There's a lot of skirting of storms up here too, just where I am, because it's like we're in the
Yeah.
south-facing shoreline that just juts out over the Atlantic, and so
Oh,
there's a
yes.
lot of it's moving offshore, but it'll clip the Outer Banks basically.
Yeah.
So yeah, but it's been pretty since I guess the last one we had that really made landfall as a hurricane in North Carolina was Dorian in 2019, and it went
Okay.
right over where I live, but it was not nearly as bad. I mean, Florence was bad for us.
Yeah.
So
And Florence was
the year before,
okay.
2018, it was bad because it it went up. It came at us like essentially due west, and then actually went south,
So it's
like
almost like it
into
stayed churning, like stuff just it just
yeah.
moved a lot of
So
water.
it did a lot of water, and so like inland flooding was really really bad in North Carolina.
Yeah.
Like the western part and the eastern parts of the state were completely disconnected for a couple of weeks.
Are
So
you
yeah, it was.
from originally from the area, or are you from
I'm from Virginia originally.
okay.
I grew up in Southern Virginia and around the Richmond area, but have lived in North Carolina off and on since 2009.
Okay. So
Brief
you're
stint in
you're you're well
Boston.
versed in all of the
Yeah.
hurricane stuff at this point.
Yes, and I mean, I would say a big chunk of my research has included hurricanes, I think, because of where I've worked.
Yep. Yep.
So, yeah, well,
And
actually,
everyone here is obviously going to be a captive audience in that as well, because I mean, St. Pete was facing just utter annihilation with that whole thing. Not that Fort Myers in that area didn't get awful, you know, effects, but like the peninsula, the fact that I mean, you're just taking it on all sides, and it's yeah, it was a lot of my colleagues were about ready to not have homes, and we weren't even sure if USF was going to be standing. It was wild.
when Florence hit, the 2 days before it hit, it was supposed to be a category 4, like coming in and making landfall where we live. And we were like, if it stays as a category 4, like everything's gone,
Yeah.
and we were so lucky that it downgraded essentially, within a 48-hour period. Because it was slow, it slowed
Hmm.
down, but it was still a big storm. Um, yeah, the storms are, there's not consensus on what's happening, obviously, with storms,
Hmm.
but I certainly think the combination of more and more people living on the coast and developing the coast, and we do see the one clear thing that seems to be coming out of the research on storms and climate change is that the uptick in intensity, like the rate at which storms are
Right.
going from tropical depression to major hurricane, is faster. So like the warning
Yeah.
time is lower, and
Yeah.
that's really important because people have to have time to repair.
Yeah. I saw something down in Fort Myers, or no, it was actually we had so for this center, we had our like annual review with our NOAA administrators, and we had a panel session, and they were talking with one of the lead Coast Guard lieutenant people. I forget what his title is. I should know that. But you know, they were talking about during this panel how Fort Myers needed like at minimum 72 hours because of like there's so many choke points, and so like just physically that number of people and cars and stuff couldn't get moved out of that area in less than 3 days. And I think part of what happened was it got upgraded and it shifted, and then people didn't have time to move. And so it's just so complex and terrifying and interesting and all the things. But yeah, the other thing I was hearing a lot of chatter about was how the paths are getting more hard or more difficult to predict as well, like the wobble. Yeah. Because of climate change, like the old models just like don't work as well anymore because the trends aren't holding. So yeah. It's like, yeah.
Well, I don't know if it'll be depressing or well, I don't know. Most of like the work we do is on category 1. You know, we usually get category 1 storms or tropical storms. And so I think some of the data I'll show are like, it's like caveated, like these are just category 1s, you know, and this is what we're seeing. So like, I don't even know, we haven't had a category 4 or 5 hit North Carolina in a long time. And so I feel like in presenting this work to a group out of Florida, it's like, well, this is category 1. Yeah. And like, you could take it one way or another. Like, it's really bad for like hard infrastructure, and it's really still up in the air for nature-based because we haven't had a lot of good tests of nature-based yet. So
I'm going to let Steve Marowski in. He's our director. So, hey, Steve. There you are.
How are you? You sound a little tinny. Oh, maybe my audio. Yeah, my audio's turned down. Good morning, Rachel. How are you?
Good morning. Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for doing this. It's so timely. You know, we're all working on things in the new blue economy right now, and also this whole notion of coastal resilience is just so resonating so much because of the hurricanes down in Florida, you know, so, you know, what you're likely to say is going to have a pretty good audience, I think.
Yeah, I was just chatting. I was like, well, I'm going to be talking about category 1 storms because that's all we have gotten up here in North Carolina in a while. And so I can't decide if that's going to make people feel good or bad down in Florida.
Well, you know, all of the above. I mean, actually, there's some analysis here that indicates that if we had a Cat 1 come up Tampa Bay, it would be just a disaster, you know, so, you know, and that's primarily because of how built up it is, you know, everything's seawalls around here. And, you know, at least in coastal Carolina anyway, there's a lot of salt marsh left down there, you know, so that you have something to work with, you know.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree. And I mean, nothing I'm going to talk about today is really addressing what I think is an even larger elephant in the room with these storms, and that's like, you know, all the infrastructure and property and like, you know, inland damage that's associated with storms. Like I just work right at the shoreline. And so I'm going to talk a lot about what's happening on the shoreline, but there's so much else going on with these storms that, you know, I don't even begin to know how to tackle in terms of the development that we've seen along coasts. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to have to be pretty clever here. You know, I think actually a lot of this lies in looking for the weak points. You know, if you've got a place completely surrounded by seawalls and the seawalls are too short, then, you know, what's the scenario? Where does it flood first? And can you acquire those lands? Could you use living shorelines? I mean, a lot of things to attenuate energy, you know, that these sort of living seawalls that people have come up with. A lot of different ideas, but clearly a lot of it centers around not having really good maps of how things would progress under a storm. And so that's, one of the reasons why we're in business, is to see if we can come up with ways to put the picture together a little bit better.
Yeah, I certainly think there's a need there because, I mean, I've struggled with some of my work to try to come up with baselines just for how much how much we've developed, how much we've changed the shoreline. And it's actually really hard. Every state does it a little differently. And
yeah.
So technology gets better, we get better at mapping, but then that means it changes the resolution of, what is a shoreline. And so it gets really hard to set a baseline and then to be able to look back, on that baseline.
That's right. Even identifying where the land and the water intersect is, and you talk to the NOAA people, that's sort of a work of art as much as it is of data, just because of the nature of the squishy land there,
Yeah, articulated marsh, like what is the shoreline? How long
Yeah.
is the shoreline of
Yeah,
a
yeah.
marsh? Like it's really hard to wrap your head around. And 10 years in and tried to look at that issue and I haven't come up with an answer yet. So somebody else do.
Yeah, well, that's a good one to work on. Yeah. I wouldn't mind talking with you afterwards about potential areas we might be able to collaborate on. There's lots going on now, and we're trying to push forward. There's the hurricanes that we've had in Florida have really energized people a little bit about, all right, what do we actually mean about improving resilience? Because you look at Fort Myers, for example, that's the type example of what is not a resilient coast. And it's really kind of interesting because if you look at Fort Myers, the barrier island was just, anything on the barrier island was just absolutely wasted. And if you look at even sediment transport, it's just extreme. But if you go back into the inland waterway and beyond where there's a lot of intact mangroves back there, and they were in perfect condition. I mean, nature's telling us some stuff, and and we keep not understanding the lessons they're telling us, right?
Absolutely, I agree.
I'm gonna go ahead and start letting people in so they don't get people get cagey when they're like, oh, I don't know where, because Teams doesn't tell you that you're in a waiting room, and so people think it's not working.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of funky. So
Can I try sharing?
Yeah, if you want to test, go for it.
If you want to test your PowerPoint, that over on the right hand side where it says leave, there's an arrow. There you go. Perfect.
Do you see a PowerPoint?
Yeah, if you want to just do the presentation mode real quick, just to make sure.
Yeah. How about now?
Perfect. Yep, that looks good.
Okay.
Do you want me to stop presenting and then, or is it fine to leave them up?
If you want to stop just so everyone can see faces before because Steve and I will give a short intro and then we will turn it over to you. Welcome everyone who's hopped on so far. We'll give people another couple minutes before we get started.
Rachel, I was reading your CV online, and apparently you were one of Pete Peterson's co-advisees. What a great guy! I knew him from a long time, and just always seemed to be so gracious and really great person, and certainly well schooled in anything coastal. Yeah.
Oh yes, Pete was a really influential part of my graduate work and definitely helped steer me in the direction or continue in the direction of living shorelines and nature-based work and help me intersect, or integrate the policy and the management side with the ecology. That was just something Pete was really fantastic at doing. My first semester of grad school, he had me going to state level agency meetings, just kind of tagging along on everything that he was doing. And that was really influential in my early grad career. So, yeah.
No, you're not the first person to say that. Yeah. He's a great guy. And I also saw that you were at Northeastern for a couple of years, and so that you must have worked with John Grabowski up there. Yeah.
Yes, I did. And we're still working together on some projects
great.
now.
Yeah.
And
He's a
also
good
a
network.
Peterson student. So yeah, there's
Yeah.
the legacy of Pete Peterson for sure. There's a lot of academics out there and around in the world of marine ecology, thanks to Pete.
Yeah, he left a generation for sure. Yeah.
All right, I'll go ahead and give my spiel. You'll probably still hear dings as people log in, so sorry about that. It'll probably happen for the next few minutes. But yeah, so good morning, or almost, I guess, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Sarah Grasty. I'm the outreach manager for COMIT. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. It's a special edition as it was rescheduled from September due to a little thing called Hurricane Ian. However, this talk is very topical to that. So, and I hope to see everyone next year when we pick up our series, probably in February or March. It'll still be on the fourth Wednesdays of each month starting at noon. And this month we have Dr. Rachel Gittman from East Carolina University with us, and I will let Steve introduce her before the presentation.
Thanks, Sarah. Before I get started with the introduction for Dr. Gittman, just a shout out to Sarah for putting the whole series together. This is the ultimate talk, and so Rachel has a nice capstone here. But it's been a really great symposium this year, and a big diversity of speakers in terms of not only their diversity of themselves, but the topics as well, and all very important to what our missions are. So our speaker today is Dr. Rachel Gittman. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Biology and the Coastal Studies Institute at East Carolina University. And her focus includes marine community ecology, restoration ecology, coastal management and policy, and sustainability science. She received her doctorate in ecology from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, where she was co-advised by the famous Charles Pete Peterson, who many of us know. And she, after her PhD, she was a postdoc at Northeastern University up in Boston. Before attending graduate school, Dr. Gittman was an environmental consultant in Washington after her graduation from the University of Virginia in 2006. So today her talk is evaluating socio-ecological functions provided by novel nature-based coastal protection approaches, which we in Florida are very anxious to hear about. Dr. Gittman.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you again for inviting me to be part of this webinar. I'm excited to finally get to give this after the delays with the hurricane. I'm glad to see that. I know there was a lot of impacts of the storm, so I'm glad to see that we're back online. And I by no means am going to be talking about hurricanes at the level that I think Florida has been experiencing recently, but I will talk about the experience that we've had here in North Carolina over the last decade or so. And so hopefully everyone can see my screen, and I will go get started. So today I am going to be talking to you about some work that I started in my graduate work at the UNC Chapel Hill, but have continued with my lab now at East Carolina University. And I'm going to be talking about some ecology, but I'm also going to be talking about some engineering and also some social science. So when you work on coastlines and you work on the intersection between nature and people, I feel that you necessarily have to be interdisciplinary in thinking about these kind of grand challenges or wicked problems associated with people wanting to live close to the coast, and also our desire to kind of maintain ecological functions and ecosystem services. So just to give you an overview of what I'm going to try to touch on today, I'll first just briefly highlight some of what we've learned in terms of the ecological impacts of coastal protection approaches, particularly shoreline stabilization strategies like seawalls or bulkheads. I'm going to be talking about performance of different approaches during major storm events, mainly Category 1 hurricanes and tropical storms that have hit North Carolina over the last decade. And we'll be looking at both kind of these gray or traditional shoreline stabilization approaches as compared to nature-based, or sometimes called living shoreline approaches. And really, I'm trying to get at this question of whether nature-based approaches can provide both the coastal protection and the ecological functions that we want. And so I'll kind of pivot to talk about some novel approaches that are being implemented in North Carolina with different companies and NGOs kind of at the forefront of that work. And then I'll just end with a few future directions that our lab is currently embarking upon and thinking about. So when I talk about coastal protection, I'm really focused on the shoreline level. So coastal protection can mean, the entire coastline into the inland area. We can be talking about flooding and flood protection, but really I work at this land to sea interface. So a majority of my work is really focused on what structures like the ones shown here are doing in terms of providing stabilization of that shoreline, prevention of loss of shoreline, but also ecological functions like habitat for marine organisms, water quality improvements, et cetera. And so the contrast I show here in these photos is kind of a traditional approach, which is the seawall or bulkhead. This is a very typical bulkhead, kind of a low profile bulkhead in coastal North Carolina, as opposed to what's considered a living shoreline in North Carolina. This is kind of a granite rock sill-based living shoreline or nature-based approach that combines both planted and existing salt marsh with this offshore rock breakwater. And I will highlight that this is an older form of living shoreline in the state. These were what were originally put in when living shorelines first started catching on in North Carolina, but we've since moved to some other strategies that I'll highlight later in this talk. And so I really started my graduate work and really got interested in this topic with the desire to understand, which approaches were really going to provide both the shoreline protection, but also sustain a lot of these ecological functions that not just ecologists care about, but coastal communities care about. And so I'm just going to summarize very briefly with a meta-analysis that I completed in my postdoc, what we know kind of globally in terms of the ecological consequences of shoreline hardening. And I will say this study is already outdated. I'm working with some colleagues who are trying to update and add to this meta-analysis right now, because this was published in 2016. And the number of studies coming out on this topic is pretty astounding, especially in recent years. But I'll just show one graph that I think summarizes what we knew as of 2016 in terms of the ecological consequences of different types of shoreline hardening approaches. And we didn't know very much, to be honest. Most of the studies that have been published on this topic that measured any kind of ecological impact were largely focused on very basic measures like total biodiversity, total species richness or species abundances, and not really on true ecosystem services like water quality or carbon sequestration. There have now since been studies that have come out to kind of look at those topics as well. And so I think an updated analysis will give us a more comprehensive view of what the ecological impacts are of different approaches. So that said, this graph is really just going to show you the impacts of three different types of shoreline hardening that are very common along coastlines: the seawall or bulkhead, riprap, revetments, which is essentially when you just put rock up on shore, and then breakwaters, which can be from a variety of different materials, but they're essentially offshore structures intended to attenuate wave energy before it hits the shore. So essentially 2 onshore strategies and 1 offshore strategy. And the 2 graphs here are showing you the difference in biodiversity on the top and the difference in abundance in terms of percent, with the comparison being between a seawall and, say, a control or reference site, so an unaltered, natural state shoreline, and that would be the comparison across all 3 of these categories. And so if you have a point on either graph that is above kind of the 0 mark, that would mean the seawall or riprap or breakwater is supporting more organisms or a higher diversity. If it's below the 0 mark, then it means it's supporting lower diversity or lower abundance of overall organisms when compared to a natural unaltered shoreline within the same environment. And so I'll just highlight here that seawalls, with our global meta-analysis, really came out as being as supporting fewer organisms in terms of diversity, and also fewer organisms in terms of overall abundance than natural unaltered shorelines. Riprap and breakwater, we had fewer studies. Breakwaters did include, in some cases, these nature-based approaches. They may all have had marsh or some living component onshore, but we really didn't see statistically a significant difference between natural shorelines and these other two options. And so obviously, as I said earlier, more work has been done since then. And so we do hope to have updated estimates of some of the ecological impacts of riprap and also breakwaters in a future study. But the take home I would say from here is to say that seawalls are not getting it done in terms of providing the ecological benefits that we want for our coastlines. And so as an ecologist, that's what I care about. I want to pick a structure or have people pick a structure that is going to support the local ecosystem. But what people typically care about when they decide on what they're going to do with their shoreline is, how's it going to perform during a storm event? How's it going to protect my property? How am I going to maintain that line in the sand that defines my private property through multiple storm events? And so over the last decade or so, we've had the opportunity, because of hurricanes crossing North Carolina coast, to evaluate the protective benefits or consequences of different shoreline stabilization approaches. And we've done this through in the field in situ surveys of shorelines before and after storm events, and also sorry, I think someone was not muted. And also through surveys of waterfront residents. So actually sending out surveys before and after storm events to ask people how their shorelines changed during storm events. And so this work has kind of encompassed 7 different hurricanes and tropical storms. I will note they've all been Category 1 or lower, so not the Category 4 and 5 that Floridians have experienced recently. So we should certainly keep that in mind when looking at the results. We've had more than 20 living shorelines monitored during these different storms. And we've had damage reporting from coastal residents from 2014 to 2022. And so I'm not going to be able to highlight all of the results of these different types of studies here, but I've put a few of the papers that are already out for reference at the bottom of the slide, and I'm just going to talk about a few of the key findings. So first, because bulkheads are the most common structure that we see in coastal North Carolina, and also bulkheads and seawalls are the ones that we found to have the least favorable ecological consequences, we first wanted to look at how bulkheads held up during extreme events like hurricanes. And so using a strategy that was employed on beach shorelines by some engineers in the early or late 80s and early 90s, we essentially did a categorical damage assessment. We had 4 categories of visual damage that could be observed for a storm event, from landward erosion to structural damage to a breach, and then a complete failure or complete collapse of a structure. And so we went out to different shorelines in North Carolina after storm events and essentially photographed, categorized, and GPSed in damage along shorelines post these storm events. And what we found with some of the storms that we've studied is that bulkheads are not 100% effective against storms. And that's not surprising necessarily. You would expect some damage, I think, with any storm, just given variation in age, in style of bulkhead structure, in differences in maintenance. And we've seen this with some of our residential surveys. People are not always maintaining their structures the way they're supposed to. But essentially what we found is in the first storm where we did this work, Hurricane Irene in 2011, around 18% of our bulkheaded shorelines were damaged. In Hurricane Arthur, a few years later, we saw a slightly higher percentage. And then 2 years post-Arthur, so no storm event, we actually see a persistence of that damage. And so there's two take-homes here. One is that we are seeing damage during storm events, and then we're also seeing a lack of recovery in the sense that people aren't necessarily repairing damage after storm events. And this may ultimately lead to further damage down the road if you get a second storm. And then we're going to come back to this finding with some more recent work later in the talk. And so this is just for bulkheads. Bulkheads were the predominant type of structure that we found to be damaged with these type of surveys. But we really couldn't look at damage on natural or nature-based shorelines in quite the same way, because trying to categorize visually what is damaged in a marsh is a little more difficult than just looking at a vertical wall. And so we coupled these categorical damage surveys with pre and post surveys we had done on a subset of living shorelines in the same stretch of shoreline where we were doing these bulkhead damage surveys. And so these are paired natural salt marsh and what we're calling these rock sill living shoreline sites. And this is in Pine Knoll Shores, North Carolina. It's a barrier island it's Bogue Banks, it's barrier island system there. And Hurricane Irene passed right over this area. And so before the storm, we had taken surface elevation data within the marsh at these sites. And we had also taken vegetation density of the marsh. And so this is represented the year before Hurricane Irene in 2010, immediately post Hurricane Irene in 2011, and then 1 year later in 2012. And so what we see here is the blue represents the granite sill living shoreline, the green represents the natural marsh, is that the surface elevation didn't change in any noticeable way across the storm event, although I will note that there's a lot of variability there in surface elevation. And so since this study, we're getting better at trying to monitor these changes. But we did notice that the sill living shoreline had an overall higher elevation than the natural marsh. And I think that'll be important to keep in mind for points later. But when we look at vegetation density, we did see a loss of marsh vegetation associated with Hurricane Irene, both the natural and the living shoreline with the granite sill did lose marsh vegetation. However, 1 year post, we did see a natural recovery of the vegetation, in particular at the living shoreline site. So the natural marsh shoreline seems to be a bit slower to recover than the granite sill shoreline. And we think this is related to surface elevation. Many of our marshes in North Carolina are just teetering on the edge of drowning, and we have sediment sand supply issues as well. And so we think that these breakwater structures are mimicking kind of natural fringing oyster reefs that used to be much more abundant in North Carolina and are providing that extra kind of bolstering of the salt marsh that enhances recovery post-storm event. So we weren't satisfied with Hurricane Irene. We felt like we needed to learn more. And so as we've had additional storms hit the coast over the last decade, we've gone out and done some similar work. And this is with a colleague of mine, Carter Smith, who's a postdoc now at Duke University, but was also a Peterson Lab graduate student when I was in the same lab. And we decided to continue to look at these natural marshes and marsh sills, but also add in bulkheads for this before and after assessment so that we weren't just looking post-storm at bulkhead performance, but we're getting some data in advance as well. And so this is Hurricane Matthew in 2016. And what you're going to see here is the first set of graphs is the change in surface elevation from Hurricane Matthew, so before versus after. And it's for natural marsh, living shoreline, and bulkhead shorelines. And one graph is showing you the waterward elevation. So this is the elevation just waterward of either the marsh or the structure itself, whether it's the rock sill or the bulkhead. And we measured this because there's been a lot of concern about structures also scouring out subtidal bottom and intertidal valuable habitat. So we wanted to look at that. And then the landward elevation is really what property owners care about. So if you see a drop in landward elevation, that's going to be considered a problem for a property owner. They're going to be losing part of their shoreline. And so what we see with Hurricane Matthew is that natural marshes and it trended this way that bulkheads also lost seaward or waterward elevation, although the error bars in the bulkhead are high and crossing zero. And the living shorelines, we actually saw a gain in elevation waterward of the structure, so some sediment accumulation potentially. In terms of landward elevation, we saw a drop in all three landward, although the living shorelines, these stone sill breakwaters with marsh, were essentially, touching zero. So there was almost, no detectable difference there. And so we were seeing some landward loss of elevation, indicating some sort of erosion associated with Hurricane Matthew, and also some waterward scouring or erosion. And so what this looks like for the bulkhead is essentially loss of someone's lawn, kind of a caving in. Often these bulkheads have rock structures filled right behind the wall, and then they put like a sod grass that's usually not very resilient to a bunch of overwash from a storm surge during a hurricane. And then when we look essentially a year later to look at recovery, what we see is that for the waterward elevation, we see gains back for the natural marsh and for the bulkheads. So there may have been some temporary scouring associated with the storm, but our assumption is that the sediments are pretty dynamic here. And so what was lost was easily put back just by the kind of natural tidal processes for these sites. However, what is interesting with the landward elevation is that the marsh, just the natural marsh, did not recover that lost elevation. So again, a lot of our marshes are teetering on this edge of drowning, and with heightened sea level rise rates in North Carolina over the last several years, this is only getting more concerning for our natural marshes. But the living shoreline and the bulkhead both had gains in landward elevation. So the living shoreline, this was kind of natural recovery, we think, of the marsh. There was no intervention by the property owners. But for the bulkhead owner, it was active intervention. So they came in and resodded, refilled. And so we have essentially a difference of natural recovery with the living shorelines 1 year, and a human intervention to then rebuild the bulkhead back to where it was for the bulkhead structures. And so given this information and what we've been seeing along the coast, in the last few years, I've been really interested to see that since we've been getting this information out to the public, since a lot of our local NGOs have really been pushing for living shorelines, I've become increasingly interested in whether or not we were seeing a shift towards living shorelines in North Carolina. And so this is some data from our damage surveys. So just as we did in Hurricane Irene, we've been going out after every storm, every major storm event, and surveying the same shorelines in North Carolina. This is a shoreline stretch in Bogue Banks, North Carolina, that we've been surveying since Hurricane Irene. And so this is just showing you the total kind of linear meters of shoreline surveyed for a given stretch. How much of that shoreline is bulkhead? How much of that shoreline is what I'm calling bulkhead hybrid? So this is where they have a bulkhead and they've also added some structures to it, like riprap or groins and jetties. And then the green, the tiny little part on top, is the green living shoreline. And so not a ton. This is post Florence in 2018, so still represents a small amount of the shoreline. I'm not showing you how much is natural shoreline, natural marsh shoreline. So we still have a lot of that here, but just kind of showing you the totals for modified shorelines. However, the exciting news is that when we surveyed the same stretch of shoreline post-Dorian, we saw an uptick in living shorelines, and also a shift from not just using bulkheads, but also riprap and adding on to bulkheads. Now, some of the downside of this is that this has been conversion of natural marsh shoreline to some other strategy. That's why the graph is taller on the second part, is because we're losing our natural marsh to modification. However, the good news is it's not all going to bulkhead. There's not been a huge increase in the bulkhead shoreline. But as we've seen over the last decade in particular, these natural marshes are drowning, they are getting damaged, and they're not recovering from storms. And so many property owners are wanting to protect the fringing marsh they have left. And so they're opting for these offshore breakwaters when they're installing living shorelines. I do think property owners are also, based on surveys and interviews, becoming less confident in bulkheads alone and are adding on additional structures, putting rocks out in front of their bulkhead, sometimes building a breakwater in front of their bulkhead, also planting marsh. So we're starting to get some really interesting combinations along the shoreline. In terms of how living shorelines, these kind of additional living shorelines performed relative to bulkheads with these two most recent storm events, Florence and Dorian. This is showing you Hurricane Florence. And so again, this is the percentage of the shoreline that is damaged among these categories. And what we see here is essentially the bulkhead damage in Florence is pretty much holding to around the same percentage that we've seen in past storm events. Roughly 20%. In Hurricane Irene, it was around 18% of the bulkheads were damaged. Bulkhead hybrid, this is again bulkheads where they've added something in front of the bulkhead to bolster it. We're seeing, around 15% damage. And then all of the living shorelines that were added to this stretch of shoreline that we've surveyed, we didn't notice any observable damage. And again, we've been trying to couple this with before and after finer measurements, given the nature of living shorelines being harder to categorize in terms of damage. When we look at Hurricane Dorian, I want to point out kind of a couple different surprising trends here. So first, we have, Hurricane Dorian was a smaller storm than Florence, but it was only 1 year later. And so we're ending up, closer to 25% of the bulkheads are damaged. And then a really large percentage of bulkhead hybrid shorelines were damaged in this event. And then also a lot of our recently added riprap shorelines showed landward erosion. And so I think what's happening here is a lot of the shorelines that were damaged in Florence, like this one here, are not getting repaired in time for Hurricane Dorian. And so this is the same site right after Florence and then right after Dorian. And so they didn't even have time to repair. Most of these shorelines, the permitting and the demand for damage repair post-Florence was really, really high. And so property owners either are not even able to repair their shoreline between the storms, or they've chosen not to. And so we're trying to get at whether or not it was, wanting to and not being able to, or just not even wanting to invest the money through our waterfront resident surveys now. And then the other thing I'll point out is that even though they're adding structures to these shorelines, it seems to be in response, to damage originally, but it's not clear that adding on is necessarily preventing damage to storm events. And so we may continue to see particularly problematic stretches of shoreline with people adding more and more structures, investing more and more money, but not necessarily getting that benefit. And so we're going to continue to track these stretches of shoreline to kind of look at that change over time. So to couple those observational surveys with some finer scale measurements, I just want to highlight a study that was not led by our lab, but we were collaborating with this group at UNCW. This is a PhD student, Mariko Polk. She, concurrently with our damage surveys, with a jointly funded grant across our labs, was out surveying pre and post Hurricane Florence, looking at surface elevation and stem densities, similar to what I did in 2014 with Hurricane Irene, but also looking at historic imagery and looking at the horizontal change in the position of the shoreline over a longer time period that encompassed Hurricane Florence. And so this map is showing you the track of Hurricane Florence, which is a really odd one. As you notice, it went actually west and then south before it went north. So it stayed on our coast for a long time. And the location of all of the different living shorelines that she studied, coupled with reference or unstabilized sites. And what she found is that in the short term, so essentially as a result of Florence, we saw overall that the control sites, so unstabilized shorelines, natural marsh shorelines, did lose some ground in terms of horizontal erosion during Hurricane Florence. And then living shorelines, there was a lot of variability, but the overall kind of average change was close to zero, and with many of them actually seeing gains immediately post Florence in terms of that horizontal position of the shoreline or the marsh shoreline. In the long term, we see similar patterns for the controls. So we are losing our natural marsh shorelines. They are eroding back on average in these higher energy areas. And our living shorelines are kind of a mixed bag. So in the long term, some of our living shorelines are losing ground horizontally, and some are gaining. And so this really has led us to think more about different designs, different strategies, and what has been used in different parts of the state in terms of materials and configurations that might increase the overall erosion protection provided by these structures, and not just the small subset I've looked at in the past were fairly robust to storms, but not all living shorelines are obviously created equal. And so that's really where our lab has ended up now, and that is to try to understand. We know living shorelines are not all designed the same. We know all substrates don't work everywhere. We know that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And we know that the ecological benefits of living shorelines are not provided equally by all designs and substrates. And we're at a bit of a compromise situation, particularly in North Carolina, because a truly living shoreline is going to support salt marsh and also intertidal oysters and all of the organisms associated with those types of structures. Naturally, in North Carolina, historically, you would have had fringing intertidal oyster reefs buffering many of our salt marshes from these storm events. However, where oysters want to grow intertidally is not always at the same height that we would want to build a structure to maximize wave attenuation and coastal protection. And so what we're really working on now is trying to understand how to design these living shoreline structures, these breakwater structures, to maximize both oyster growth and biodiversity support, but also to attenuate wave energy and prevent both that short-term and long-term erosion of the shoreline. And so this is just an example of one substrate we've been working with over the last couple of years called oyster catcher. It's a biodegradable substrate. It's a cement dipped jute cloth that's wrapped into whatever kind of structure you want. So this is just one design. And the idea is that it's biodegradable because we were looking, this company was looking to provide a substrate that would go away if it was put in a place where oyster recruitment was not very good or oysters did not cement in, so we didn't end up with material out in the coast that was not native to North Carolina. This has been a problem in our state with a lot of new living shoreline structures going in that are involved or include plastics. So they're plastic mesh bags of oyster shell. And so this is being touted as an alternative to oyster bags. And so we've actually tested these structures against oyster bags in terms of their performance of growing oysters, but also for shore protection. In terms of oysters, oyster catcher is fantastic. This is a kind of zoomed in shot of this structure a few years later, completely covered in oysters. And I've noted the paper at the bottom of the slide that kind of documents all of the different metrics that we compared between oyster bags and oyster catcher substrates for this particular project. These structures have been in since 2018, and we hope to go out next year to kind of give a 5-year assessment of how they're performing 5 years post-construction. And so we're continuing to try to explore this, conundrum that we're facing with where oysters want to grow and where we want these structures to be relative to wave heights, particularly during storm events. There's been a lot of work in recent years in North Carolina identifying an optimal growth zone for oyster reefs based on how much aerial exposure they get in the intertidal zone. We now know we want to be between 20 and 40% of the time we want those reefs to be exposed to air. And we know where that spot is in terms of the elevation and the height of these structures. We also know that oysters essentially want to keep pace with mean sea level, and that they can keep pace even with the current rates of sea level rise. So they're pretty fast growers. And so if we can kind of design our living shorelines to be within this optimal growth zone to allow oysters to grow and keep up with mean sea level, we could have living shorelines that are not only providing coastal protection, but they're actually able to respond and be resilient to climate change by growing with sea level rise. That's the hope. That's the ultimate goal. So what about coastal protection in the meantime? So right now we're asking these questions again with these novel substrates, and we're looking at differences in vertical relief. So where you start with your structure before the oysters even grow on them. And we're looking at not just storm events, but at boat wake waves and other wind and kind of ambient wind-driven waves. And so I'm going to show you some results from a study that's being done now. These were constructed in 2020 as part of a grant funded by the U.S. Coastal Research Program. And so we really asked 3 main questions. How does the vertical relief of these structures, these oyster breakwaters, affect how much energy is impacting the shoreline? How does the vertical relief of these structures affect shoreline erosion rates? And then how does the vertical relief affect the survivorship and growth of the salt marsh? So all of these are questions that have been that we've come to based on our understanding of the fact that living shorelines are not all designed the same. And so we're really trying to pinpoint an optimal design, at least for here in North Carolina. And so this study site is in Taylor's Creek in the Rachel Carson Reserve. We have, again, 2 different substrate reliefs, high relief and low relief. And I'll show a picture of what these look like. And then control sites. This is a highly boat trafficked shoreline. So there's a big, huge boathouse right around the area, and there's lots of boat traffic in the summer. So low fetch, but high boat traffic area. And this is part of the Rachel Carson Reserve, and so there's a real incentive to want to prevent continued erosion of this shoreline. This is what the structures look like in 2020, and there's essentially a 10-centimeter difference in their height between the high relief and low relief. This is a different design than what we employed in 2018 with Sandbar Oyster Company. It's more of a table structure. And so this was really driven by the company wanting to try a different design. And in terms of site monitoring, we're monitoring the marsh edge, whether it's moving horizontally and also vertically in terms of elevation. And we're monitoring oyster counts on the reefs and stem counts for marsh stem density. We're also now working with some coastal engineers, and we're monitoring wave energy. So we're looking at wave attenuation and overall wave energy impacting the shoreline at these sites using these DIY wave sensors that were developed by some coastal engineers at Mississippi State, and we've since adopted their methodology. So wave attenuation, for those of you who don't think about waves a lot, and this has been pretty new to me, is simply the reduction in wave height or energy from point A to point B. So in our case, the height of the wave before it hits the structure minus the height of the wave after it hits the structure over the height of the wave before, and you multiply by 100, you get your attenuation, or 100%. Wave transmission coefficient is another variable that you can calculate, or it's essentially the ratio of the transmitted to the original wave height. And this is a little diagram showing you where our sensors are placed relative to our oyster breakwaters, and then how we calculate that coefficient. So to show you some preliminary results from this study, this is from 2020 to September of this year. The first graph is showing you oyster density per 0.0625 meter squared quadrat, so a small little quadrat on the reef. And these are oyster counts within that quadrat. The blue is your high relief reefs, and your orange is your low relief reefs. So 10 centimeter difference between the heights. And essentially what we're seeing with oyster densities is, on average, the high relief have recruited and maintained a higher density of oysters than the low relief. However, we do see a cyclical pattern here, and we think that pattern is driven primarily by lots of juvenile oysters recruiting, some of them being consumed, and then the ones that survive are growing to be bigger adults. And so if you look at the other graph on the slide, you see that oyster length of surviving oysters is increasing over time for both structures. And so overall, we have oysters growing on both, but the high relief reefs are supporting more and also bigger oysters, which is what we were hoping to see, because higher relief breakwaters are going to also hopefully provide better shore protection. We are also seeing, however, this kind of leveling off of our reefs. So I mentioned that oysters are going to grow and kind of try to meet mean sea level. And so with our high relief reefs that were set really close to or approaching mean sea level, over time, we are already starting to see kind of a leveling off of that growth, that vertical growth. And that's represented here with both graphs. So the first one being over time, with the y-axis being the elevation of the reef itself. So even though they were set at different elevations, they are also growing because the oysters are growing. And then elevation versus oyster abundance, we're also kind of seeing this leveling off. And we think this is because these reefs, particularly the high relief reefs, are approaching that mean sea level. And so again, the hope is if sea level goes up, then we'll start to see an uptick in these reefs growing as well. So now let's look at wave attenuation, because this is obviously what people are going to want to think about if you're a property owner. And so this is the control site. So this is no breakwater. And so this is showing you essentially the seaward wave height on the x-axis and the landward wave height on the y-axis. And the one-to-one line is in the middle. And so what we're seeing is a lot of scatter. Essentially, there's not really attenuation consistently or amplification consistently. It kind of depends on the water depth and the original height at our control sites. So not surprising, we're just kind of seeing waves transmit across the surface of the shoreline. And our average KT is about 1, meaning there's essentially no change from our seaward to our landward sensor. And again, that's not that surprising considering this is the control site. However, what is surprising is that we see a similar pattern for our low relief reefs. So it's just kind of scatter. We're not seeing consistent amplification or attenuation by our low relief reefs, and we're also not seeing it with our high relief reefs. Now, I will point out that these heights, these wave heights, are really small. This is a low fetch area, but lots of boat traffic. So we're getting lots of little boat wake waves. And so this is not necessarily meant that we have a lot of shoreline erosion, even though we're not able to actually document consistent wave attenuation. We are seeing consistent shoreline gain. So we're seeing a lot of sediment accumulation at our breakwater sites. And we're also seeing over time that the marsh shoreline is actually migrating seaward, meaning that it's gaining ground. in terms of the original habitat. And so this is represented in these two diagrams here. The blue line is the 2020 marsh edge shoreline, mapped with a Trimble RTK. And then the 2021 shoreline is in green. And so in our oyster breakwater sites, we are seeing the marsh actually migrate down towards the breakwater. And we think this is because of this sediment accumulation and protective benefits of these breakwaters. Our control sites, however, are migrating landward. So we're continuing to see erosion of that marsh. So even though we don't have wave attenuation that we can document right now, we are seeing sediment accumulation. This project is ongoing, and so we have at a minimum at least another year of monitoring here, and so we'll have to see what we find out in the coming years. So just to wrap up, in summary, we do see evidence of oyster reef crests, the height of these reefs growing over time with the natural recruitment of oysters. And we think this is driven by recruitment of oysters that are then growing and surviving to adulthood. Sorry, this is showing. And so as they grow in height, they're going to be inundated for less time, which should increase wave attenuation, although we really don't know what's going on with wave attenuation at this particular site. And we do see that should be and seems to be increasing sedimentation landward of those reefs. Backwards. And so we hope that with that increased sedimentation landward, that we'll also continue to see oyster growth as well, because we'll have continued stabilization of these sites. However, this is only 2 years into the study, and so we really feel like we need more time to definitively say if these structures are going to perform in the long term. Particularly if sea level rise increases, or the rate of sea level rise increases. So our next steps are really just to continue to monitor these sites in the same way. We've also added in drone flights. So we have flights from before the structures were built, and we're trying to fly them annually after. And we're continuing to monitor the oyster growth and see how these structures are changing over time. This is just a photo from September of 2022 showing the live oysters, the live adult oysters on some of these reefs. So I just want to end with a few next steps and future directions. So most of what I presented to you today in terms of the nature-based approaches has been focused on this one substrate called oyster catcher. I am not an owner of oyster catcher. I'm trying to be an independent tester, I guess, evaluator of this structure. So we have since moved on to also working with other companies. This is a substrate called Quick Reef that's being installed in North Carolina by a company called Native Shorelines. And so we've recently partnered with them to also test their substrates. They've put in these structures at several different properties. So now we have multiple private properties we can now work at. We're taking the same types of data, including wave energy measures. We are seeing attenuation at these sites. So we know our wave sensors are actually functional and we're getting good data. We think we're now in a better environment to measure wave attenuation. And so this project started in 2022, and we're going to continue to monitor these sites for the next 4 to 5 years. With the current funding that we have. And so maybe in 5 years, I'll have a really good story to tell about the Quick Reef substrate and its performance. And then another direction that I didn't really get to touch on a ton in this talk, but I want to highlight that's kind of ongoing, is this coastal protection decision making. So I've talked about meeting or surveying property owners, and I've talked about how private property owners are really who's making, they're making the decisions about what is going on these shorelines. They're choosing what structures to put in. And some work that colleagues of mine have done and others elsewhere have done have shown that what seems to be driving decision making in many areas is what your neighbor does. So this is a study out in Alabama by Stephen Cyphers and colleagues. He's a collaborator of mine, showing that if you have a vertical wall, chances are your neighbor did too. In Georgia, they saw similar patterns where presence of neighbor armoring was one of the most predictive or best predictors of having armoring also. And then in North Carolina, we most recently also shown that if you have a hardened shoreline, you're more likely to have had a neighbor that has a hardened shoreline. But we've also been able to show that if your neighbor has a living or a natural shoreline, you're more likely to have a living or natural shoreline. And that these relationships seem to be independent of other environmental factors like similarity in fetch, or all the living shorelines being in low energy sites and all the bulkheads in high energy. We don't see those relationships. It really does seem to be driven by people making decisions related to what their neighbors are doing. And in North Carolina in particular, we asked them, how much does your neighbor influence your decision? And we did see that people were admitting that their neighbors influenced their decision making in many cases. And so given that, we're really trying to understand how to get information out and get people to accept other strategies and put in other strategies in hopes that there'll be kind of a grassroots approach to living shorelines. And the positive news here is that I can say that since I started working on living shorelines and shoreline hardening in 2009, I think there were 40 living shorelines in the state of North Carolina that were considered and classified as living shorelines. Last year, more than 60 were put in just by essentially one company. So I do think we are seeing a major uptick in nature-based approaches being implemented at the private property owner level. And so I think there's a lot more to work to be done in terms of the social science side and understanding why people make these decisions. And so with that, I would just want to acknowledge a huge number of collaborators across multiple disciplines and all of the wonderful graduate students in my lab, but also other labs that have been working on this larger issue. This has been a team effort for sure, and has also been supported by a very wide variety of funding sources as well over the years. So I'm happy to take questions if we have time.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and we'll give you a online a round of applause. All right, so much appreciated. I've got a ton of questions, but I wanted to see if my colleagues, or in particular any of the students, might want to ask a question first, and then we'll kind of dive into the 15 questions I have. Any of our students want to venture?
If a student won't take it, I have a quick question.
All right. You're close enough, right? So,
okay. I guess so. So Rachel, a fantastic talk. I feel like I could talk about living shorelines for a very long time. But so you mentioned that you're starting more of these social surveys alongside, and so does managed retreat ever come up in your conversations with people?
So I have kind of avoided that topic only, but not because I'm not interested, but there are other people working on managed retreat, and I think people more qualified than me. I'm an ecologist, and I think managed retreat is like it's a very complicated issue, right? Because it involves economics, it involves multiple generations of people living in a certain place and cultural identity. And so I was actually at the University of Chicago about a month ago for a panel, and there was a woman there who was working on managed retreat post Superstorm Sandy. And listening to her talk, I was like, oh, I'm so glad that I don't really get into managed retreat, because it is so much more complicated, I think, than just like the decision making that's made like right on the shore. I have tended to want to focus on, once a person decides they want to stay here, what do they choose to do? We have asked questions about how people plan to prepare for climate change or sea level rise. And I can say in North Carolina, it's been overwhelmingly, we're not going to do anything. Or, you get comments like, well, my house won't be here for my grandkids to inherit. It's not there's not a lot of movement towards wanting to leave, or at least, any suggestion that people want to leave. And again, I think that has to do with, there has to be a way out, right? People have to want to buy your property, and that's going to be an issue. Now in North Carolina, I would say property values are only going up on the coast. So maybe now's the time you should sell your property because, yeah.
Just to amplify your point on managed retreat, National Academy had a panel discussion down here in St. Petersburg on managed retreat. It was part of a study that had nothing to do with St. Pete, but just the fact that that meeting was here drove the governor's office crazy, right? Because it sounded like people were actually proposing that for Tampa Bay, so you're absolutely right. It's a politically loaded landmine, that's ready to go off. And you're right. This is all about community and economics and whatnot. And certainly, us poor technical people, I mean, we can serve up the options, but we can't make a decision. Very good. We got Matt and David and Cheryl, I think.
Rachel, thanks for the talk. I think it's really interesting stuff, sort of the intersection between the, ocean science, marine science stuff that we do, and then some of the social science elements is, I think, increasingly unavoidable for us purists. That I'm more of an ops guy, so the questions I had was kind of methods driven, and how the results you presented about landward and seaward elevation gain and loss. How it looked like maybe you were measuring that at points, like with six points on the ground, and then taking relative measurements with the Trimble. And you mentioned airborne stuff, so I was curious as to some of the details there.
We're in a transition. So the first study I did, we were using actually laser level with an RTK ground point. So I was laser leveling in permanent quadrats, old school. That's when I started my graduate work. That was my plan at the time. So Irene would have been laser leveled in with a trimbled in reference point at each site, like a piling or a dock, whatever I could find to get the permanent point. And then Carter Smith kind of carried on when we got essentially an upgraded Trimble. And we actually had two, and we could kind of compare. We went straight with Trimble measurements with permanent marked areas instead of the laser level. And then, and honestly, with the Mariko Polk's, the 2021 paper, also Trimble, but she was also doing some drone work as well. Although I think the Florence paper is largely just representing Trimble walks compared to historic aerial imagery of the shoreline. So she was just looking at the horizontal change, not the elevation change for the living shorelines, using a process like it's called analyzing moving boundaries in R. So that was the strategy she was using there. Now I would say the UNCW lab, our collaborators there, and also we are shifting now to drones with the Trimble ground truthing, and so we're just starting to do that now. We have tried a terrestrial laser scanner, and actually some of the oyster work I've been involved in has been terrestrial laser scanner, essentially digital elevation model changes of a whole oyster reef. The problem with that is it's really time intensive to scan an area. And post hurricanes, you don't always get the low tide that you need. So the drones have definitely been where I think we want to move. My graduate student, Megan, is now working with Hannah Siriani is in the geography department here. And she does a lot of remote sensing, but also a lot of drone work. And so we're now trying to fly all of our sites and really use both the Trimble and the drone data to tell us what's happening along the shorelines, because it's really challenging. And there's a lot of error, right? Like I feel like what we can only detect, I mean, Hurricane Irene, I was like, yeah, there's no elevation change, but I'm like, the error bars are huge. It's basically like there's no detectable change, right? It's hard to know. It's not a huge disaster. It's not like you lost this huge section, but there was probably fine scale, changes in the marsh itself. So for finer scale work, we're also still trying to do things like feldspar markers to try to look at sediment accumulation, although I'd say that's been hit or miss in our sites. I don't know if it's because our sites are so sandy, the feldspar doesn't stay. So yeah, it's still a real challenge. I'm very open to continued improved methods, especially for elevation change. You can't install an SCT or set everywhere either. So yeah,
especially in a in that sort of environment, which by nature is dynamic and functions best when it's able to be, right? So yeah, I think the good news is there's a bunch of ways to skin that cat. It's also the bad news, and like there's probably a dozen different rabbit holes you could get lost down methodology wise. But I think if you're looking at going airborne in some fashion, that's a good route to pursue. And then I'll dig up a few links too. There's been some really neat work done with like consumer grade technology and integrating that both handheld and with drones, because like literally these things have lidars. There's been folks who've done quite high quality 4-dimensional mapping of coastlines with an iPhone pre and post storm.
That's pretty amazing. I would love to not have to spend $30,000 on my next Trimble unit.
Right. So
when mine finally dies.
So depending on what's good enough, and I think as you perhaps as you increase your coverage, your need for precision goes down a little bit in terms of looking at what an entire shoreline is doing, versus when you are literally looking at sticks in the mud, you need really good elevation control because it's the only data point you got, and you're trying to extrapolate from there. And then like your SNR is going to be, as you discovered, like all over the place with those error bars. So anyway, I'll I don't like monopolize any more of the time, but I'll shoot you some links either directly or via Sarah. I'll do a little roundup.
Yeah, and Rachel, I just want to make sure, are you okay on time, because we can always do follow-up questions.
No,
okay.
I'm free until 2:00.
Well, hopefully we won't keep you that long. David?
Thank you for your talk. Sorry, I was a little bit late. I had a schedule conflict. I was just curious about the human factor. Around Florida, we have people who love to kayak and drag their kayaks through the mangroves and seagrasses to get out into the water. And of course, stepping over oyster shells is not a good thing. So I was just curious if you've ever had any issues or concerns or complaints about these types of barriers.
Yes, and it's a funny thing that of all the things that I would have thought of that would prevent people from choosing certain options, I did not think simple things like, I want to be able to walk down to my shoreline. Like I was like, oh, it's just going to be money. It's going to be protection, during a storm. But no, we do have people who simply say, I don't want a marsh, or I don't want oysters because I have grandchildren that are going to come to visit and I don't want them to be cut up on oysters. Or the other one is rocks equals snakes, according to a lot of people, that if you put rocks or any kind of like structurally complex structure where there's nooks and crannies, you're going to get snakes, even though in the salty part of our waters, there's no snakes that are going to live down there. Now in our tidal fresh areas, yes, I totally get it, and that's why I don't work a lot in our tidal fresh part of the state, because I don't like snakes in the water. It's just not a pleasant experience. So yeah, a lot of that is access, and that bulkhead provides this like nice clean line, open lawn. They can walk out to their dock and have their little kayak ramp. But we've seen living shorelines designed with, they have to have gaps in them. And so we've seen people design them where they make their kayak launch in the gap between the structures. And so I think you're never going to prevent people from not wanting something because of safety. I mean, I've been caught on oysters thousands of times. And so I get it, but yeah, it comes up a lot.
That's good to know. And just to follow up on Matt's comment and techniques for monitoring, A very expensive technique would be these very high precision satellite remote sensing data streams, $10,000 a day type of thing. So, it'd be cost prohibitive, I suspect. But have you looked into those potential options through academic pursuits where maybe they wouldn't charge as much?
I have not, but I know there are people who are doing like larger scale shoreline monitoring, who do use those data streams. And then there's a company that does actually produce living shoreline substrates as one of their products, but they also do have access, that have paid for the access to these commercially available data sources, and are doing a lot of shoreline change mapping, for clients. And so I know they're doing it, but they're doing it from the, private sector consulting side. And yeah, on an average grant, it's probably not going to happen for us. And I'm honestly hoping to be less of the one doing those types of change analyses. I'm trying to collaborate with more people who are working with different technologies, like like Dr. Siriani at ECU. That's all that their lab does, is work with, remote sensing data and drone data. And so I would really like to move back to looking at more of the ecological measurements and not having to be a one-stop shop to answer these questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think you've caught the leading edge of an area that's going to be a pretty major, component moving forward, probably for the rest of your career. One question we have here is the issue of converting bulkheaded residential areas back to living shorelines. And a lot of what we call land here was actually created in the 1930s and 40s, and the bulkheads were put up. They're not high enough, and but people are more interested in, rather than just perpetuating hard structure, to reconvert those to something a little bit more resilient, right? And so I wonder if you have any experience on that side of the ball.
So here, the only time I've ever seen bulkheads converted is when they fail. People take that as the opportunity to go ahead and convert to something different. But I have spoken to people in Florida in the past, and I've visited a couple times in past talks, and actually kayaked a whole canal system at one point looking at some of these. And it is a challenge. Like, if you have these man-made waterways and this artificial or land that was not there and not the right slope, our current permitting structure is actually not set up to really help people make those decisions, because you can't fill public trust water, like, no matter how modified it's been, without additional permitting and review with the Army Corps. And so in places where people do really want to change from a bulkhead to a living shoreline, I've seen in Alabama, I've seen people actually fill on top of the bulkhead and then essentially plant over it. So not remove it. And that only works with the really low bulkheads.
Yeah, sure.
And again, they have to go through additional permitting to bring in that fill and do that. But that's been one strategy I've seen. And then in Florida, I've seen kind of this greening of the bulkhead, where people bring in vegetation, or they maybe build out some rock and then they bring in vegetation, and it's like a living seawall instead of a straight bulkhead. And I think it depends on how much people really want to make that conversion, because I do think it ends up costing them time in terms of permitting, and often involves more money, because ripping out the bulkhead is also problematic, right? Because then they're going to lose that land that's being essentially propped up by that bulkhead too.
Right.
So yeah, it's a challenging situation. It's much better just to not have it ever put in place to begin with, because once you've got one, it's not going to be easy or cheap to go to something else, unless the storm takes it out for you, and then you just start over.
Yeah, I think that's the issue. Yeah, I mean, back in the 30s and 40s, there wasn't much of a permitting issue out there. It was, pretty much whatever developers wanted to do. This has been a great introduction to what you do, Rachel, and I really appreciate it. I have a feeling that a number of us may contact you offline and, just talk about some of these issues and where we stand with things. And, we are a type example quite different from, the salt marsh, habitats that you're dealing with. A lot of these are either barrier island beaches or they're, heavily modified coastlines that we're in this conundrum of things right now. So, but very interesting. And again, if we're ever going to increase the resilience of our coastline down here to things like megastorms, we have to do something different, and so figuring out what that is, that's the transformational question, I guess. So
I think one of the places with the most promise is a lot of these companies are coming up with 3D printed substrates and modular designs, and I think we're seeing people add on to their structures, right? They're adding rock or they're adding something else, and perhaps that's one strategy.
I've seen these structures where they're sort of like a stair step structure that you put in front of the bulkheads, and it's to basically, instead of having a vertical structure where the waves are actually reflected, that you actually attenuate the wave action before it hits the bulkhead itself, right? And so those could be either living or non. You could, basically put oysters on them or whatever vegetation you might want to do. So there's probably a whole series of halfway measures, I guess you'd call them, that might be more natural like, Anyway.
They're all band-aids until the big decisions have to be made, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of, it's like, I feel like we're just trying to buy time.
Yeah, and you look at a place like Fort Myers, I mean, they have the opportunity right now, to figure out, and, whether they are going to take the opportunity in zoning or, not rebuild a lot of those structures, probably not, because as you know, in these areas, there's the sense of don't kick them when they're down kind of thing. Just put it all back the way it was. And I'm afraid that we will spend billions of dollars perpetuating the non-resilient coastlines. But
well, and that's related to a question in the chat about, are there tax incentives or anything, or any kind of incentive right now for residents to install living shorelines? And that's probably varies municipality to municipality, but
Does, but in North Carolina, the main way that people can get, it's not a tax incentive, but essentially it's a cost share program. So the North Carolina Coastal Federation is probably the largest NGO in the state working on living shorelines. And they have received a lot of funding, both from the federal government through different grant opportunities and also from our state legislature recently, to essentially cost share living shoreline construction. So they have property owners apply for a living shoreline, and Coastal Fed will maybe provide the labor and the plants, and they have to pay for the substrate. And then the companies that are hired to provide the substrate and the installation are often discounting, their substrates or their labor because they want to be the company that installs living shorelines in the state. So that is certainly what's driving, I think, the recent uptick in North Carolina. There's a waiting list right now to get on this cost share program for living shorelines. In Alabama and Mississippi, I think a colleague of mine, Eric Sparks, is down at Mississippi State University. He works in extension, and they have some kind of, I don't know if it's a cost share, but it's an incentive program as well. And I want to say Florida has toyed, different parts of different municipalities in Florida have toyed with the idea. State to state, municipality to municipality, there have been different versions of tax incentives and cost shares. probably be a good idea to someone to actually like figure out how many different strategies have been used and what's worked best.
You know,
So
I
Sounds like a
think the
social
other,
scientist.
I think the other
Thanks.
incentive there is going to be if the academic community can ever demonstrate that living shorelines actually reduce the losses, you know, from catastrophic storms, that basically the insurance rates for those coastal properties would go down, and you know the insurance rates are just escalating exponentially at this point. And so if there was ever an incentive to be had, I think that would be the ultimate one. And if we could demonstrate that, you know, X is better than Y, then that would be a positive feedback loop, you know, that could.
And there have been, I've been at conferences and meetings where representatives from insurance agencies and then also the insurance agencies that insure insurance companies, which I think
Reinsurance agencies.
they've been coming to talks and trying to figure out like, you know, how does this fit in? But I don't know, and I know at like larger scales, like, you know, for say an entire city, there have been conversations about if you invest in certain types of infrastructure, maybe the overall insurance strategy might change. But at the private property level, I haven't seen anything change from an insurance company perspective yet. But it probably has to do with the fact that it's not just what they do along their shoreline, right? Like there's so many other things. How high is your house and how far back are you and et cetera. So yeah.
Very cool. Well, we've covered a lot of territory here. Yeah. And I really appreciate you spending your time with us today, Rachel. And I again, I wouldn't doubt that a number of us may contact you afterwards and see if we can push these issues around a little bit. So again, thank you for your time and excellent talk, and really appreciate it. So with that, thank you all very much. And again, thank you, Sarah, for the seminar series. We'll be back again next year with a brand new lineup of people. So thanks again.
Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day. Bye, everybody. Thank you.